Yes, thanks. Hi there. I'm Norbert, as already introduced, and I love being here and talking about things I love and my experiences. And yeah, the guys already introduced me. I'm from Hamburg. I work for a small company near Düsseldorf, which is quite close here, and I have there a mixed role, part consultant, part software engineer, and part software architect. I'm interested in many things, and today we already saw so many creative ways how to use technology. The problem is just to find the time for it. This is really sometimes annoying because there are so many interesting things. But let's not talk about me, let's talk about Vue.js. I gave this talk the subtitle, An Advanced Introduction, meaning you can follow along if you have either some knowledge in React or Angular or Vue itself. So I won't spend time with Hello World or simple template syntax because that's not that interesting and it's quite similar to other frameworks. And we will have more look from the architectural point of view. How does Vue tick? What tools does it give you as a developer? And how can you construct dynamic apps with it? Just before I start, two remarks. If you have any questions or I mentioned something which you haven't heard of before and I don't have the time here to explain it in detail, just approach me afterwards and just give me feedback or tell me how many pandas you would give my talk. I would love to hear that. And the second remark being, I will talk about Vue.js because I love it and I like to use it, but I don't want to imply with that the other frameworks aren't great either. So it's not against each other. I think we can be really grateful that we live in these times where we can choose from so many great and stable frameworks. Let's start with what I do with Vue.js. So I started around 2 years ago. My first contact with it was when the 2.0 was just published. It was not that known 2 years ago, but already stable and production ready. So I introduced it at Lucom, and we started using it for smaller projects, and later continued with more complex ones. And beginning of this year, we went all in when we decided to use Vue as the basis for our main product, for the client-side rendering engine. Our main product is the Lucom interaction platform. And to give you an abstract definition of it, it's kind of a WordPress for web forms. It's not really the exact definition. Don't tell my sales colleague that I told you that, but for here now, it's enough. More interesting is how do we use Vue there. So we have a design tool where you can drag and drop all the UI controls you want, arrange them and configure them with the dynamic features you would like to use. So for example, which validations, you bind them to data sources, attach functions to it, which uses a server-side API, JavaScript API, and when is in control available, editable, by whom, workflows and things like that. So this is a specific tool which produces at the end an XML file. This is then uploaded to our Java server, and at runtime, when someone opens the form, the server interprets this XML and generates a JSON out of it, containing all the information the client side needs to represent this form. So in the browser, we are running a generic Vue.js app, and this Vue app doesn't have any specific templates or components in it, but it's built up of very generic components because we don't know at development time how the form will look like. So instead of developing specific components, we have to develop generic components which will render and generate the component tree and all its behavior at runtime. And so far, we are in the middle of developing it, but it runs very well already. And so far, we haven't encountered any problem where we couldn't solve it with the toolset and the API Vue gives us. So no hacks were needed so far, and I'm very convenient that we can finish the whole product with just using Vue's API. Let's have a high-level view on Vue before we go into more details. So it can be used without a build step, just like Angular 1 used to be. You can just drop it into a site and use it just like with jQuery to do some simple DOM manipulation. It uses HTML templates by default, but you can also use render functions, because render function is the basic API. HTML templates are also compiled down to render functions, and even JSX if you like to. It's all about components, nothing new here. So this is the main building block you build your applications out of, and all the other concepts and things revolve somehow around these components. What really sets Vue apart from other frameworks is its reactivity system. It uses no dirty checking, but it registers watcher functions into the attributes of your state, and when you change them, Vue gets notified and can re-evaluate everything what depends on that attribute. So this, most of the way, it just works and you don't have to know about it, and this is one reason because, that Vue is considered very beginner-friendly, because you don't need to think about it. But it makes sense to have a little bit of understanding how it works behind the scenes. Just some keywords of other parts which are part of the Vue API. We'll cover that in a little bit more detail in a minute. Very common for Vue projects are the single file components, where you can just put the template, the logic, and the styling into one component, into one file, but you don't have to use that if you don't like it. The Vue core team does not only maintain the core library, but also some additional libraries, like, for example, the Vue router, the Vuex for state management, CLI and DevTools, and other things like RSJX bindings. So that's very convenient because they take care that everything works very well together. And what's very different to other frameworks is that Vue is not backed up by a big company. It's a group of independent and distributed developers. They are sponsored. Some of them are sponsored by companies, but not one single company does own the framework or the team. Yeah, so this slideshow itself is a Vue app. I used a little library called Eagle.js, which is meant to be used for slideshows. It's just a small wrapper around the API of Vue and uses, for example, the animation API for the slide animations. I will give you the URL for the GitHub repo at the end, so you can have a look at the slides and an example for a Vue application in this at the same time. So, as I mentioned, the basic concept is to build components. And one big question when starting an app is, how does where does my state live in my application? How does information travel through my component tree? And let's have a look what Vue offers there. It's the most simple form is to just use properties and events. You can pass properties into a component and get events out of it. And so this is, of course, bound to the component tree. You cannot communicate sibling components at the same level. And this does not scale very well. When your component tree gets bigger and bigger, you need a different approach. Another thing which you find quite often in Vue apps are a separate event bus. You can just create a separate Vue-Instance and just use the eventing features of this and emit events and subscribe to these events in other parts of your app. So this is a little bit more flexible, but it doesn't scale that well either because it gets confusing and it's hard to debug. So when you have a huge app and many components, I wouldn't recommend that. So as in other frameworks, it makes sense to use a central state management. Vuex is the default choice for the Vue world. It's implementing the Flux architecture, but transfers it into the Vue world. And as Vue is not built upon immutability, so Vuex isn't either. So it has no reducers, but mutations. And these mutation functions are responsible for mutating the state. And then the standard reactivity system kicks in and informs all the components, which depends on that state. So we have talked about components, and we have talked about state management and local state and how you can pass information between components. What else is there when you're constructing a more complex application? Let's have a look, just very briefly. Vue has mix-ins. I know that the React world discouraged using mix-ins for various reasons, and the same reasons apply here as well. So you shouldn't overuse mix-ins, but used with care, mix-ins aren't bad in itself, but you shouldn't overuse them. When you see that yourself using it too much, you should think about different approaches and patterns. You can extend components from each other, which can be a very convenient way when you build something basic and just want specific components out of it. Vue has a simple plugin API, and I would recommend having a look at it, because even if you don't intend to share your functionality with other projects or publish it, it makes sense to think in this way, that you encapsulate something which has an API, and to move it into a plugin really forces you to do that. Vue also has this animation API, which I already mentioned. It does not contain the animations itself, but it gives you an API to attach the animations to it, so you get informed during the render when something appears at the screen, entering state, leaving state, something like this. Vue also has slots and scope slots. We will talk about scope slots in a second. Slots we already saw this morning in web components. In Vue, it's quite the same. Vue is closely constructed that it's very similar to web components, and it just adds some functionality on top of it. There's a simple dependency injection in Vue as well, but it's not the same as in Angular. It's just for providing something at one point of the component tree and injecting it in other parts. It's not that powerful than in Angular. Then there are directives. This is quite similar to Angular, and filters are more or less the same, like pipes in Angular for filtering output, displaying numbers in a localized way, or dates, or something like that. And then there is the component. It really is called that. It's a component which has the name component. And you can use that in templates as a placeholder for dynamic component at runtime. I will show you an example how to use that in a minute. But let's move to another subject first. This is not part of the API, but it's a pattern how you could extend one component without using mix-ins. And so another way is to use higher order components. When we have a look here at the right, we have a generator function which gets a component passed in, adds some additional logic, and then returns a new component. This is just a very basic example. We just render here the component we got, and here in our lower part we have just a placeholder for a simple component which we would like to enhance with some additional component. So when using this here, we import the basic component, we import the generator function, we call it by passing the basic component in, we get the higher component back, and then we just register it here and use it here in our template. And at runtime, it looks like this. We have here the higher order component, and the basic component is wrapped inside of it. So this is a general pattern how you could enhance components without integrating it into them, because mixins you have to decide at development time of the basic component to use a mixin inside this component, and a higher order component adds logic from the outside. So you can use this in Vue, quite similar to React, but it's a little bit more complicated because Vue's API is a little bit bigger and it has more stuff to it, edge cases. When you want to solve everything very generic with events and listeners and attributes, it's a little bit more tricky, but it's possible. Here at this URL, you find a general approach, which implements a general function, creator function. You can pass a component in, and the features you want to add to this component, you get a higher order component back. Have a look there. There's already also linked a discussion in the Vue repository with the Vue core team how higher order components are working in the Vue world. Very interesting if you want to dive deeper. But often you have an alternative approach in Vue, which are scoped slots. So instead of having a generator function, we have here a simple wrapper component, which defines just some logic here. We don't need to know. This is just a placeholder for any logic. And here in the template, we just provide a slot, which is a placeholder for something which our parent component can fill with content. And this content runs in the scope of this parent component. So usually the parent component cannot access features from the slot provider, because the slot provider just has a placeholder here, but not a direct communication channel. But scoped slots add this feature. So we can bind attributes to the slot. In this example here, this local data attribute. But of course, you can also pass in functions and callbacks, so you can expose an API to the slot. And when using that, in our app component, we use the wrapper component. And inside it, this is our slot. The content of our slot at runtime is the basic component. And to get access to the slot scope, we just need to assign it a name. This is a name you can freely choose. So the wrapper component scope here is the name where I can access all the properties which are bound to the slot in my wrapper component. And in this example, I'm just using it to extract it from the wrapper component and pass it down to the basic component. This is a little bit tricky, and if you don't follow right now, don't be mad with yourself or with me. It's a bit tricky, but once you get it, it's very powerful, because instead of hiding something in a generator function, you're very declarative here. You see, when you know what slot scopes are and how they work, you see immediately that this wrapper component wraps a basic component and passes something out of the slot scope into the basic component. And it's not only an alternative for higher order components, but for other use cases, a very powerful tool as well. So it's documented in the official documentation, but it's easy to overlook its true power. And at runtime, the component tree looks the same as the previous example. We have this wrapper component, which just wraps our basic component. So let's have a look at some examples how you can use this tool set for some dynamic features. These are just examples to give you an idea how Vue ticks, and you can have a look at these examples later on. They are also in the repository. So let's just go No, this is not the one. This is the one. Here's an example, the usage of the component. We have here a template, which is a functional, with a functional keyword, meaning it's a functional component, because it does not need its own state. It's a way to just to not use memory and for a local state when you have a functional component. A functional component means that you have a slightly different way of accessing attributes, but we don't need to look into that in detail right now. Just have a look here. The component gets an attribute is, which defines at runtime which component to render here in this place. So this component attributes is a string for a component representation. And we also bind all the attributes which are contained in this options object to this component rendered here at runtime. And then we look if this children attribute is present, and if so, we loop through this, and we include the generic component wrapper in itself that many times for each children once. So with this simple approach, we have a recursive rendering of dynamic components. And this simple example does not bind events to it, but it also already passes every props which are in this attribute down the component tree. This is a very flexible way, and this could look like this. You have here an object, and we have here this component as our root component, and this component has two children, another component, and my input component, just random examples. And of course, this could be nested as deep as you want. Next example is a generic input component, which is able to bind to a Vuex property in our Vuex store dynamically. So when we're rendering dynamic components, we cannot decide at development time where the properties live in our central store when we use input components or other input controls. So we can write a generic input component which gets just a binding, which is a string notation, where my attribute I want to connect with this input component lives in the central state. And then we define a computed property, and that's the default way how you access central attributes in the Vuex store, with a separate getter and setter. The getter uses a helper function just to convert this string notation with dots in it to the actual object tree the store provides. So we pass here the binding string in and the store itself, or a part of a store. And the setter is separate because we don't want to change the store directly. So we have to dispatch an action so our central state management can take care of that. And here at the bottom, we have a simple render function, which renders an input control, attaches some listeners to it, and the value itself. Last example is a dynamic Vuex module. You can register at runtime Vuex modules, which are part of the central component, central state in the store. And here's the idea. We want to separate all the validation rules we have in our components into a central state, because again, we don't know at development time which validation rules do we have. So normally you would write them into your component, and each component would have a local state, and you would just validate that. But it makes sense for a dynamic app to separate that into a part of the central store. So we have here a function which returns a Vuex module, And this function generates here a local Vue instance, which is just used as any Vue instance would be used to contain all the validation rules. But to be dynamic, we generate all the computed properties at runtime. You can have a look at it later in how these helper functions here work. So you pass in the path to your attributes you want to validate and the validation rules themselves. So for example, you have an array like this. You have here an attribute called first name, which is required, and a last name, which is also required and has a minimum length of 4 characters. It uses the Vue-Validate plugin for the validation itself, but that's not part of the example. It's just an example how you can use very dynamic and creative way the features Vue provides to separate this into a single component, which is not part of the rendered tree, but it behaves the same. So Vue does take care of everything, the change detection. It's just separated into a different part of your application. And then we make it accessible via a getter function, which is part of the Vuex store. We can access our validation state. So I hope you could see or feel a little bit, because I cannot go into that detail that much. I would like to. I'm more used to doing workshops, which are 1 or 3 to up to 3 days long, so I have more time explaining concepts. So I just wanted to give you an impression how Vue ticks and feels like, and I think when you haven't seen it before, this is enough as a takeaway. So concept-wise, it's a little bit in the middle between React and Angular. It has templates like Angular, but also render functions. And when you know either framework, you will find that Vue.js is really approachable and fast to learn. It is, in my experience, very flexible, powerful, and scales well. I haven't encountered any bug in the framework itself. So, and the team behind Vue is very approachable and welcoming, so it's a really nice community as well. Have a look at scoped slots if you intend to build something more complex, because they're a really powerful tool. And also look at UI libraries, because they implement generic components and to be used in other projects. So they implement a lot of these concepts, and it's really interesting to see how they solve it. Yeah, and some exciting stuff is announced for the next major release of Vue.js, for example. They will re-implement the reactivity system by using JavaScript proxies instead of object-defined property, which they are using now. And they will overcome some limitations the current implementation has, and some other very exciting stuff as well. But that doesn't mean the current version is not usable. It's just some exciting plans for the future. And you can find the slides of this talk at this URL. I will treat this in a minute as well. And I built it a couple of months ago, a little sample implementation, which contains various concepts, higher order components, and scoped slots, and things like that. You can find a sample implementation with a lot of comments just to try it out. Yeah, with that, we reached end of the talk, and I hope you liked it.